Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the first of the Community Infrastructure Levy Steering Group meetings held today, Friday, the 24th of July. My name is Councillor Jonathan Vinehall, Lead Member for Strategic Planning. This meeting is being held remotely and is being live streamed via YouTube, and the recording of this meeting will be available afterwards on our website. Councillors and officers are reminded to put their mobile phones on silent if they have one near them, leave their cameras on for the steering group members, and for other members to leave their cameras off until they may be asked to speak. Mute their microphones when not speaking, as this will reduce feedback and background noise and saves bandwidth to prevent any loss of connection. I'll first do a roll call to check all the members who are expected to attend are present. As I say your names, please turn on your microphone and confirm you are connected. Councillor Bayliss.
Present.
Councillor Oliver.
Present.
Councillor Prochak sent her apologies, and myself obviously present. Councillor Dixon may be with us today. No. Officers joining us today are Dr. Tony Leonard, the Executive Director, Tim Hickling, Head of Service for Strategy and Planning, Nicola Waters, Planning Policy Manager, and Scott Levercar, who is the Principal CIL Officer. We have two technical staff operating the live broadcast, and to help if there are any technical difficulties, they are Claire and Kieran. Democratic Services Manager today is Lisa Cooper, who's also in attendance. When we're making decisions, we'll do it by roll call. However, there are only two decisions today, one the appointment of chairman and one for the appointment of another member to this committee. Because of this new format, members are encouraged to make their comments succinctly and pertinently to ensure the smooth running of the meeting. Those members who may wish to speak, please indicate by typing your surname only into the chat facility. The chat facility is persistent in that it cannot be deleted, and any inappropriate use would be deemed as a potential code of conduct matter. Officers wishing to respond to members' questions, please type interject. I'll ask members who have asked a question if they wish to come back after receiving a response, so there is no need to type your surname in the chat facility twice. Requirement that all members will have read the paperwork published on the website, and members are reminded not to press the leave meeting if you need to leave the room. Just remember to turn your cameras and microphones off at that point in time. Please be aware that there can be a short time delay of around 5 seconds before a member appears on screen. So on that basis, I will commence the meeting, and the first thing is for me to hand over to Dr. Leonard, who will ask for the appointment of chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Vinehall. The first item on the agenda is the election of the chairman. May I have a nomination, please?
I would look to propose Councillor Vinehall.
Thank you. Is that seconded?
It's seconded by Councillor Bayliss.
Thank you. Any other nominations? Thank you. In that case, Councillor Vinehall, you're duly elected as chairman of this Community Infrastructure Levy Steering Group. I will just add one point, just for the notes on YouTube, that quite often we refer to Community Infrastructure Levy as Sill, so get used to the term Sill. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you for that. I do actually have a note from Councillor Cook, happy to being substitute for Councillor Prochak, but I don't think we have a substitute arrangement at the moment. But thank you for that, Councillor Cook, and there will be plenty of opportunity to ask questions. Councillor Oliver, you said there's some background noise. Are you still experiencing background noise?
Yes, really quite significant background noise. I don't know whether it's an attendee's got some other kit on or not. Perhaps I'm the only one, but I've got no other devices on.
Did you want to leave the meeting and return immediately, see if that solves the problem?
No, my connection is fine. I think there's obviously something else out there. Perhaps that person has now done something to their equipment, because it has actually just subsided.
Okay, I think Councillor Harmer is also getting some feedback as well. All right, well, let's progress and just hope that that just goes away. So apologies for absence. We have Councillor Prochak. That's the only apology we have. And the declaration of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? No declarations of interest. Thank you very much. So that takes us to item 4, which is the amended terms of reference report to Cabinet. and that's a verbal update. Can I ask Dr. Leonard to speak on that?
Yes, Chairman, if I just may, the terms of reference are normally presented to the steering groups just to make sure that they're aware what Cabinet has set out in their requirements for this piece of work. That's set out before you. I always recommend at the end of the meeting that you refer back to them, Chairman, to make sure that we're going in the right direction and to set the programme for the next meeting as well. Within the terms of reference attached, there is a suggested amendment to the recommendation which will need to go back to Cabinet, and that's to take the membership of this group up to 5 elected members and to include the Cabinet member for Finance and Performance Management, which is Councillor Dixon. If you're comfortable with those, Chairman, then those will be referred back to Cabinet.
All right. Either Councillor Bayliss or Councillor Oliver, do you have any issue with that recommendation?
No issue for me, Councillor Oliver.
So,
do you need a proposer? Because I would propose that.
Thank you,
Chairman. Because it is a change to the recommendation, yes, you will need a proposer and seconder.
Right. Thank you, Councillor Bayliss, and Councillor Oliver. Would you second that?
Indeed, it would. No problem.
Okay, and so I'm in agreement. So that is agreed to be referred to Cabinet. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this takes us to actually the main core of the meeting, which is a presentation by Nicola Waters on the introduction and background to the Sill. It's quite a detailed technical subject, and the purpose of this meeting was to brief members of both the steering committee and any other members who are interested. And I'm glad to see we have quite a few today on that, and that will form the basis for then the discussions at the next meeting. It would have been nice if we were a little more advanced, but obviously the COVID situation took us backwards, and also the appointment of the CIL officer who is now on board, Scott Labacar, who one of his key initial responsibilities will be to do quite a bit of analysis, which will feed into that first discussion. So that gives him a little bit of a buffer time to do that. So on that basis, I'm going to hand over to Nicola, and it's your show. Let us know whether you would prefer us to ask questions during your presentation or the end. Nicola. Can you hear us, Nicola?
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with my computer. So what I think I'll do is I'll turn my video off because it makes it speed up a little bit easier for me. But I will be sharing a presentation with you. So I don't think you necessarily need to see me at the same time. So I'll just load that up. Can everybody see my screen?
I certainly can. Can anybody not see the screen? I think you're ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So as Councillor Vinehall has said, I'll be doing a hopefully brief introduction to community infrastructure levy for the steering group and providing background to Sill. So what I'll be covering in the presentation is based around these 4 themes. So what is Sill and what can it be used for? And I'll be talking about the differences between strategic Sill and local Sill. I'll be talking about the Rother District Council Sill charging schedule, Sill spending, and then the next steps for this Sill steering group referring to the terms of reference. And I've split the presentation into 4 sections, and I'll take questions after the end of each section. So I'll pause and we can have discussion around those points. So I hope that's acceptable.
That's fine, thank you.
Okay, so what is Sill? So Sill is a charge which can be levied by local authorities on new development in their area, and it's an important tool to help deliver infrastructure needed to support development. It's quite a long and detailed process to adopt Sill, which was independently tested through an examination in public process, and I'll go through a truncated version of that process later on in this presentation. So Sill applies to development, most new development of 100 square metres or more, or where it creates a new dwelling, that can be potentially liable for the levy. There are a number of exemptions to Sill, and some of them are detailed on the screen. So residential extensions and annexes which are below 100 square metres aren't liable for Sill. Dwellings which are self or custom build units. Affordable housing is also exempt, and there are a number of other specific exemptions such as charitable development. So when we collect Sill, we receive the money, and I'm hoping this diagram sets it out quite neatly of how that money is then divided up. So 5% of the money received gets put to administration expenses for administering the Sill process. Then somewhere between 70 and 80% of the money is put into, I'm going to use the term pots for the purpose of this. 70 to 80% of Sill is put in a strategic Sill pot, and then 15 or 25% of Sill is then put in a local Sill pot, and the purpose is to pass on to parishes. The reason for the difference between 15 and 25% for local Sill is that automatically, if there is Sill liable development within a parish, 15% is passed to that parish. But if there is a made neighbourhood plan, then that rises to 25%. This Sill money is passed to parishes twice a year, and the Sill relates to developments which have commenced within that particular parish. So what can Sill be used for? And this is where I'm going to make the distinction between what we're terming as strategic Sill and local Sill. So I'll cover strategic Sill first, and that's the portion that's retained by Rother District Council. And Sill can be used to fund a wide range of infrastructure. The definition includes transport, flood defences, schools, hospitals and other care, social care and health facilities. So that's a very broad range of facilities that can be funded by Sill. This could include things such as play areas, open spaces, parks, green spaces, culture and sports facilities, healthcare, academies and free schools, district heating systems, police stations and other community safety facilities. But one thing that we can't use that strategic money for is to deliver, to fund affordable housing. And that's key, and I'll come back to that later. So we must spend that Sill money on infrastructure needed to support development of the area and decide what infrastructure is needed. And that infrastructure is informed by something called the Infrastructure Delivery Plan. And our latest version of that document is from March 2019. So moving over to local Sill, so that's the Sill which is then passed to parishes. So we are obliged to pass a meaningful proportion of Sill to parishes, and that's where I refer to the 15 or 25%. And there's a much wider definition of Sill for local Sill that is passed to the parishes. So that must support the development of parish council areas by funding the provision, improvement, replacement, operational maintenance of infrastructure, or anything else that is concerned with addressing the demands that development places on the area. So there's a much wider definition of Sill that's passed to parishes, and which that money's passed to the parishes. And the clear distinction also is that parishes can use their local Sill for affordable housing delivery should they wish to do so. The money should be spent within 5 years, and if it isn't, Rother District Council can ask for that money to be repaid back to us. But there is a slightly different process for Bexhill, because there isn't a town or parish council within that area. So I'll just cover that to make the distinction specifically for Bexhill within our district. So we still we retain that Sill money, and we are charged with administering how that is spent, so the process under which that comes from. So there's still the meaningful proportion, the 15% or 25% if there was a neighbourhood plan. And that's still covered by the wider definition of Sill. So the wider cover that talks about improvement, replacement, operational maintenance of infrastructure, or anything else that is concerned with addressing demands of development. But there's no set process of agreeing how that money should be spent. But it's clear in the regulations that we must engage with communities about how that local SIL money is spent, and it should match priorities expressed by the local communities. So that's a very brief run through of what SIL is, and I'll be moving on to the charging schedule next. But does anyone have any specific questions at this point?
If somebody's got a question, if they'd like to put their name in the chat facility, that would be useful. Okay, so we have several questions here, and I'm just going to take them in order. They're popping up all over the place. Councillor Cortell, followed by Councillor Oliver, Councillor Tempe, Councillor Harmer, and Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask Nicola whether we can receive a copy of these slides?
Yes, I can make them available after the presentation is finished.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Oliver.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. With regards to the local SIL, is it distributed on application, or is it then sent out and then there's a monitoring process thereafter? So the mechanics of actually getting the distribution into the parishes, please.
Okay, so the money's collected by us, and we pass that to the parishes twice a year. So I believe that's April and September. That money is just automatically passed to the parishes on those dates. They are parishes. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback. Is everyone else getting that as well?
There is a bit of feedback, yes.
Okay, I'll start again. I don't know if it's me or somebody else.
Continue.
So once the money is received by the parish, they are required to report on that annually. There's no particular set format, but they are required to detail what's been received within a particular time period. I believe that's financial year. And they are then required to detail if they've spent that money and what they've spent that money on. That report either must be displayed on the parish council's own website, or in the absence of that parish council not having a website, then it must be displayed on our own for the district council website.
Okay, thank you for that, Nicola.
Thank you.
You've cleared that point up. Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Tempe.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wondered, Nicola, when does RDC get the SIL? Is it when the project or the development is completed, or is it before then? Okay,
so when planning permission is granted, the applicant has to assume SIL liability, so that's accepting that that SIL should be collected, and the SIL actually becomes liable on commencement of a particular development scheme. And depending on the scale of the SIL monies, there's different requirements. So if the total SIL liability is less than £50,000, it's required to be paid within 60 days of a development starting, I believe. After that, if the money equates to higher values, then we have an instalments policy. So it's split down depending on the total value of the scheme. Our instalments policy is available on our website, and I can distribute that round to members should they wish to see that afterwards, and that details quite clearly in a table what the requirements are. So in essence, we receive it a period after a development is commenced, but if it's a large scheme, it's phased payments.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Have we had any? Has everybody honoured the SIL that's due?
Well, I haven't got the exact figures to hand with me, but generally, we are receiving SIL payments. There is a process under which we are obliged to go through should those payments not be received. If developments don't pay up, we are obliged to at least presently, charge interest on late payments, and we can also apply a surcharge for late payments as well. So there are penalties for not paying on time, and the Sill liabilities are attached to the development specifically. So if it gets to a point where the money isn't collected, it becomes a charge, a land charge on a development. But if you need further information on that, I'm sure we can provide that for you after.
I'm just thinking of the development on Restwood Road that's been going on forever and ever and ever. And where are we on Sill on that? I mean, if that's a separate discussion, that's fine.
When you refer to the development on Restwood Road, are you referring to North East Bexhill?
Yes.
Yes. So that scheme was actually granted permission before we implemented Sill. So there were developer contributions relating to that site, but that was dealt with by Section 106 rather than Sill. So that development wasn't Sill liable.
Okay. So, thank you very much.
Just at that moment, Nicola, before we move on to Councillor Harmer, just to clarify that point, if you could, when and on which developments Sill became liable, and if they weren't liable, is there a possibility that they might become liable if they make changes to their permission?
So yes, if they make changes to developments that requires a new planning permission, but they may be Sill liable, but we can check the exact wording because it needs to relate to specific application. It's something we can look in and provide a more detailed answer for you.
I think Dr. Leonard just wanted to add something to that.
Chairman, just going back to the original question Councillor Timpey asked about instalment payments. As Nicola said, any amounts less than 50,000 is 100% payable within 60 days. Then there are two other categories: amounts from 50,000 to 300,000, 50% is payable within 120 days, and a further 50% payable within 360 days of commencement. Then amounts over 300,000, again, it's those two I just referred to, and then the final payment within 666 days of completion of the development. So there's an instalment policy with three phases on that, depending on the amounts and value of the money coming in.
So I would just add to that to clarify, Sill was adopted at a particular date, and any applications that had permission before that date would not be liable for Sill. But as Nicola said, if they put in a new planning permission, it might become liable for Sill, depending on the nature of that change. And how much is received to date will be dealt with at another meeting. So, Councillor Harmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got two questions of my naivety. The first question is, what's the difference between Sill and the new homes bonus I've been hearing about? And in terms of Sill, so from what I understand, Rother gets 15% because we haven't had a neighbourhood plan. And it gets a bit more complex from my side. So considering that my patch, West Bexhill, has had pretty much all the house building, how will Little Common benefit from part of the 15%? And also, in terms of a developing happening, there has to be lots of amendments and what have you with the roads to make it accessible. Where does that money come from? Does that also come out of the strategic Sill, or does the developer have to put extra money in to make them things happen?
Okay. If I could, I'll take those questions. I'll respond to those questions in a slightly different order. So if we go with the road example that you're talking about, if a development needs to, on granting planning permission, is required to make amendments to a particular road layout or provide a new access road as part of that development, and that would be part of the planning application. So that would be funded, generally would be funded by the developer, because it is required in order to make the development acceptable in planning terms. So it needs to be considered with the planning application. It's part of that planning application process. So it wouldn't normally be a Sill consideration. That would be something that is part of that planning application. I'm a bit woolly when it comes to new homes bonus, so I think perhaps maybe Dr. Leonard or Mr. Hickling might be able to cover those two.
Dr. Leonard, would you like to?
Yes, there are two distinct issues. The Sill is a taxation or an agreement on that basis, whereas the new homes bonus is a government grant to local authorities on performance of house building. So the more houses you build, the more new homes bonus you receive. They have been looking to phase that out over recent years, but they are seeking to bring that back or continue it. But in terms of the new homes bonus, it is an award of grant from government to local authorities on their performance of house building.
Oh, that's explained perfectly, Terry, thank you. But just to follow up to my other question, as I said, West Bexhill's took the hit, if you like, on the house building. So I would have liked to have thought they could have had a fair bit to say on the nice bit, what they could have out of the 15%. I hope you don't think I'm being... you can appreciate where I'm coming from. We've got 3 major developments here and a little bit of bonus money to do some nice stuff, if you like. So maybe we could be considered a little bit with that.
Yeah, perhaps I could sort of address your comment. I mean, the whole purpose of this steering group as we go forward is to expose and address all those issues. I mean, clearly one of the issues for Bexhill is at the moment there is a town council. That's why the money is being held separately to be used, and there was a committee set up to deal with that, although no money has been spent at this point in time. But they are the sort of issues that are absolutely right to raise as we go through the process. I think just to add to Dr. Leonard's distinction between new homes bonus and Sill, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, Dr. Leonard, but new homes bonus is paid on applications approved by the district council. Should an application go to appeal and be upheld, I don't believe we get the new homes bonus on that. Is that correct, Dr. Leonard?
That is correct, yes.
So just a sort of just a highlight as another consideration for planning committees. On that basis, I'll move on to Councillor.
Oh, sorry, could I do
please.
apologise. I'll just ask on that question. So, for example, Clavering went to appeal and lost. So, are you saying that we've lost a new homes bonus, even though they're going to be, if they will be built?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Correct. Yes, exactly. Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Jonathan. This one's for Nicola. Going back a bit, you said that custom build houses do not attract Sill. Now, could you just define custom build for us? Because I'm assuming that doesn't mean that if a large proportion of, say, a large development consisted of prefabricated or timber built or system built houses, that wouldn't come under the heading custom build, I hope.
Okay, the term custom build and self build is defined in the Self Build and Custom House Building Act, I believe, and there are specific requirements that a developer or a landowner would have to meet in order to qualify for what is termed self build exemption, and they use the term self build to cover self and custom build. And one of the requirements is, in order to apply for a specific exemption, is that the individual who's applying for the exemption must live in the property, and I believe it's for 3 years once it's completed. Otherwise, we can claim back the Sill money. So there's a process in order to make sure that the individuals are living within that property for 3 years. And there is a slight distinction between, what could be termed as self-build and what could be termed as custom build. But for the purposes of this, they're all called self-build, and they have to meet specific requirements under which to claim the exemption for that period. If they then sell that property later on, after that 3-year period, then they've met the qualification.
Happy with that, Harry?
Yeah, thank you for that. It was the difference between custom build, self-build, I fully understood. It was custom build brought me up a bit short. Second one, if I may, local consultation. You're saying that Sill must be spent the Sill spend must meet the needs or the expressed needs of the local community. Are we going to put in some official consultations and an official consultations period on a sort of Sill by Sill basis, or is it just a general we can be trusted to know what the community wants? So is it going to be formalised and tied to specific Sills or not?
So when I talked about consultation specifically, that was in respect of the local Sill for Bexhill. The guidance doesn't define what local consultation means. So it's something that we would need to be particularly mindful of, and then come up with an appropriate strategy about how views are made on what that Sill should be spent on. But that specific reference I made to consultation was in relation to the Bexhill Sill, because there's no unlike in a parish, there's an elected parish council that then is able to spend the money for the parish's behalf. There isn't that process in Bexhill, but the regulations it's not defined under what that consultation means. So it would be part of the purpose of the group or the process in order to establish exactly what consultation means in this regard. Sorry, I know that's a bit of a woolly answer, but it's not particularly clear.
I think that's fine, because that would seem to say that Bexhill is an anomaly because it doesn't have a town council, but we're about to fix that. So by then, I think by the time we get a town council, it would seem that the regulations and which regulations do and don't apply are going to become a lot more clear when we no longer have this sort of anomalous status for Bexhill.
Exactly. There is currently, under the current arrangements with that are adopted by the district council, was a committee set up to look at applications for Sill for Bexhill. And that's in abeyance because at the first meeting, none of the applications were successful, and then it was decided to have a steering group to review all of this, and at the same time, the Bexhill Town Council was being considered. So this will be the opportunity going forward to bring all those issues up. Before moving on to Councillor Bayliss, Tim Hickling wanted to say a word. So could I have Tim in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It was just a point that Councillor Harmer raised about West Bexhill, and particularly with the Barnhorn Road development. The original outline was granted pre-Sill, so there's been two incarnations since then. There's been two variations where a school was originally proposed and now housing has been granted, and we've recently approved a slight variation in part of the layout to add 16 additional units. Those two elements are still liable outside the affordable housing. So the whole of the Barnhorn Road isn't still liable. That was just the point I was trying to raise, albeit it's subject to homes bonus because we granted. And I think, as Tony's alluded, the Clavering Walk, because it was allowed on appeal, we don't get the homes bonus, but we would get the Sill. So it's quite a complex system at the moment, because Sill's only been live in Rother since 2016. So we've still got some permissions being built out under the pre-Sill arrangement. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for that. Could we move on to Councillor Bayliss, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And quite a few of my sort of questions have been answered, but it was just really to ask. So, if a Bexhill Town Council is set up, I assume from that sort of date, either the Sill money can be transferred into sort of within their ambit. But also the rules about affordable housing that in Bexhill, because I sort of assume that the money coming into Bexhill will be quite substantial because of the amount of development that's going on in the west of the town, the east of the town. that actually that might provide some funding towards affordable housing. Is that correct?
So yeah, money that is passed to a parish area, a parish or town council, the parish council can use their local proportion, that 15 or 25%, depending on the status of whether there is a neighbourhood plan or not. They can use that money to fund affordable housing. Now, I haven't had any local examples of that, so I don't know how it works in practice, but that is within the defined parameters of that money that's passed to that particular body. So yes, you can use that. Just to probably pick up on the point that Tim made earlier, and something I also covered, is North East Bexhill was granted pre-Sill, so that there wouldn't be any Sill from the North East Bexhill example. And as Tim has already explained, the original planning permission at Barnhorn Green wasn't Sill liable. But there, as you say, there are a number of developments in Bexhill that would achieve Sill, that would then ultimately be passed to a body should there be one.
It might be worth clarifying, just making clear that anything that the district council builds, unless it has an exemption, is also liable for Sill. So we end up paying Sill on our own developments, if you like. I suppose the area that we're purchased at Barnhorn Green would be liable for Sill. Is that correct? Tim or Nicola?
Well, I believe the area that we purchased at Barnhorn Green is for employment development, and I'll come on to this later in the presentation. But employment land isn't Sill liable. But if I've got that wrong, then someone please correct me.
So there's one more question from Councillor Harmer, and then we'll move on to your next section, I think. Councillor Harmer, you had a question on how much is the new homes bonus?
Yes. How much is that? For instance, what amount of money did we lose for the Clavering appeal? And what's the percentages? How much do we actually get? And going forward, could we have a grant? I like the idea of the new homes of the town council, but also maybe a part of it could be in a grant system. Thanks.
Who'd like to?
We will get that information to you outside of this meeting, because it's going to take a little bit of trawling through some spreadsheets for that information, but we'll get it to you, Councillor Harmer.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Cortell, I did have you there, and I apologise, you were actually in line. Could we have your question?
Thank you, Chair. Could I ask Nicola how the Sill liability is calculated?
Okay, so it's based on the floor space of a particular development. So I mentioned earlier on in the slides that anything that's under 100 square metres isn't liable unless it creates a new dwelling. Then if it creates a new dwelling, it is still liable. The amount that is liable is based per square metre, and I will cover the figures later on in the presentation.
You happy with that, Paul, for the moment?
Yes, thank you.
I think Nicola's coming on to that.
Yes.
On that basis, Nicola, can I ask you to move on to the next part of your presentation?
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to go backwards a little bit before we can go forward. So I'm just going to talk about how we developed the Sill charging schedule, the process. Now, I'm not going to go into it in huge detail because it took a long time, but I'll just give you kind of the brief overview, if you like. So we had to develop an evidence base to show that Sill could come forward, and that was based on some background information. So it had to be undertaken and adopted. It is dealt through an independent examination process, and overall the process took a little over 2 years from the commission of the evidence base through to approval at full council, and then onto the date when it became effective, which was the 4th of April 2016. So we had to have some viability evidence that was brought forward. So it looked at property values and the costs of developing across the district and how those values vary across different areas. Now, that's an oversimplification, really. In essence, it is more complicated than that, but generally that's what those reports looked at. And they made recommendations as to to how Sill could be charged across the district. And alongside that, we had to develop something called infrastructure funding gap analysis. So that was a document produced to demonstrate that there would be a funding shortfall for infrastructure without the introduction of Sill. So that had to demonstrate to the inspector that if we didn't have Sill, there would be a shortfall of funding for particular types of infrastructure. Now, it wasn't expected that Sill bridges the entire gap between the infrastructure needed to deliver the development within the adopted plan, so the core strategy, the overarching strategy for the district. But it demonstrates that it did bridge some of that gap, and we wouldn't have been able to make a good case going forward that the Sill was needed without demonstrating that there was that infrastructure funding gap. So the purpose of it was to demonstrate that if we introduced Sill, it would help to reduce the gap of providing the specific infrastructure needed to support the development. But there was always the expectation that there would need to be money from other sources in order to fund the specific types of infrastructure. And in order to identify what type of infrastructure was needed to support the development within the core strategy, we had to produce two documents. One document's called the Regulation 123 list. Now, I know that's not a particularly helpful name. It doesn't roll off the tongue. It doesn't particularly mean anything to anyone. But essentially, it's a list of projects or types of infrastructure that's needed either to be funded wholly or partially through Sill in order to support that development. And the infrastructure delivery plan effectively fleshes that out even more, names specific items of infrastructure, whereas the Regulation 123 list is quite high level and just talks about types of infrastructure such as highways or education or libraries, that kind of thing. It doesn't go into it in particular detail. So we produced those documents. So the consultants' reports, the funding gap analysis, the infrastructure delivery plan, which we sometimes refer to as the IDP, the Regulation 123 list. We used all those documents to produce a draft charging schedule. So that's figures relating to what Sill would be, what the Sill charge would be across the district. And we had 2 rounds of consultation. Initial round collected comments, had feedback, produced some more information, filled in any gaps that was identified through that consultation, and then ran a second round of consultation to receive further public comments. And then we submitted those documents for independent examination. So it's a bit like the examination in public for the DASA, which we did last year. You give evidence in front of an independent person who comes to a particular view about the document, and he produces a report. So the evidence was heard by an inspector who made some modifications to the charging schedule based on the information that he heard, and the council gave evidence at that examination process, and also third parties who were perhaps arguing from a different perspective. They also were able to put their points forward as well. Inspector's report was produced, which made, as I said, modifications to the charging schedule, that we could adopt the charging schedule, assuming we made these specific changes to that document. And then the charging schedule was approved by full council on the 14th of December 2015. And there was a slight delay of the document coming into effect, but that's normal. And Sill came into effect on the 4th of April 2016. So anything that was granted planning permission before that date wouldn't be Sill liable unless they make specific modifications. That means they would become Sill liable in the future. And I just wanted to have a side note here, and I'll touch on it later in the presentation, but talked about the Regulation 123 list, really sexy title that it is, and that will be changed at the end of this year, and it will be replaced by something called an infrastructure funding statement. And we're required to publish one of those by the end of the year, so December 2020. And that will look at infrastructure needs across the district, the anticipated funding from developers, including Section 106, where we still receive those for some developments, and how infrastructure will be funded in the future, whether it be through Sill or other types of funding streams. So just as a side note, that will be replaced. So moving on to the actual adopted Sill charging rates, hopefully this table is clear, but it sets out what development is liable, what isn't liable, and then where there are specific exemptions. So I've talked about exemptions within the regulations where particular types of development aren't liable, but in doing the work to support the Sill charging schedule, we chose not to charge Sill on certain types of development. So we don't charge Sill development, Sill charge on employment sites, for example, recognising that they can be quite challenging to bring forward. So we have 3 particular zones within the district, and I'll show maps on subsequent slides for you to show how that actually looks across the district. But we have 3 zones. So Zone 1 incorporates Battle, the rural north and west. And on the next slide, I'll show you the map showing how that's split across the district. And you'll see that, for example, residential development in that zone is £200 per square metre, whereas sheltered and retired homes, retirement homes that are still housing, have a slightly lower Sill rate of £140 per square metre. Then in Zone 2, excuse me, which incorporates Rye, the Hastings Fringes and the Rural East, there's a lower value there of 135 square metres. And then the third zone is Bexhill, where that area is split into 3 different categories. So we have an urban area, a rural area, and then where we have our strategic urban extensions, though the values are different, recognising that there's different types of infrastructure, on-site infrastructure that may be required on those sites that perhaps reduces values to bring them forward. So there's a range of Sill rates across there. And then extra care housing, so what is termed in planning under the C2 use class. It is housing provided generally for older people, but not exclusively, that has an element of care within it. That has a different Sill rate also. And then the only other type of Sill liable development within the district relates to retail floor space, and we have 3 different types of zones for that. And again, I'll show maps on subsequent slides of how that relates there. And that's split into what's termed as in-centre and out-centre. So I'll show you what the maps are for in-centre, and that's where that charge applies. And anything outside of that area has a different Sill charge. So and just to point out that it talks about convenience floor space and comparison floor space. Convenience floor space is retail space where you go and buy your regular day-to-day items, so your pints of milk and your bread and shower gel and that kind of thing. And then comparison goods are kind of your bigger, more expensive items, things that you don't buy on a day-to-day basis, and there's different values for that. So anyway, moving on to how those zones look across the district. So this is a split across the district for the residential Sill charging zones. So you'll see on the western side of the district, Zone 1, including Battle, Rural North and West, is Zone 1. Zone 2 is Rye, Hastings Fringes and the Rural East. And then Zone 3 is the Bexhill area. Now I'm going to zoom in on the Bexhill area here. So I mentioned on an earlier slide, there were 3 zones, A, B and C. So Zone A is our urban area that has a particular value. Then green is Zone 3B, so that's our rural area for the purposes of Sill charging. And then that rural area yields a higher Sill rate. And then our strategic zones, which is the area shown in orange, that has the lowest think that, but I believe that probably has the lowest sill charging area. I talked about the other types of type of sill liable development. So this is our retail charging zone in Bexhill. So this is the in-centre. So anything within this blue area that is retail convenience floor space is charged accordingly against the schedule. Anything outside is then charged on the out of centre zone. We have zones also in Little Common and Sidley. They're shown the areas coloured in blue. We have an area for Battle. Again, the in-centre area is the area covered in blue. And then we also have a charging zone for Rye. Again, the area covered in blue is the in-centre charge. So that's the sill charging schedule. Very brief, hopefully was helpful. Does anyone have any particular questions about that?
It's very helpful, and I'll go to questions at the moment. If I could just add one little piece to that too, Nicola. The charging rates that you saw were the base level charging rates, and they actually increase every year. So, for example, in the rural areas, I think the charges increased by about 14.5% since they started. So, for example, the figure of 200 is now about 229. Is that correct, Nicola?
There's an additional. I can't remember the exact term it uses, but the rates go up each year based on a particular index that's set out in the regulations for sill, and that's calculated by our planning business support team. So yes, Councillor Vinehall is correct that those values do change on a year-by-year basis.
Yeah, the TPI rate, I think. Councillor Tempe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Could you tell me, Nicola, how these zones were decided upon, and what was that through guidance from other perhaps councils or information from the government? I mean, who decided what zones were going to get what?
Okay, so it all goes back to those consultants' reports that I referred to earlier on in the slides, and I didn't go through them in detail because they're really, really long, and they wouldn't necessarily be something that everyone would want to pore through. But basically, they're looking at what it costs to bring forward a development across the district. So it would have looked at lots of different types of development. Would have included employment originally, and it looks at what it would cost to bring those sites forward, so including buying the land, building them out, and then what values they would reach at the point of which they were completed. So if they were to sell them on, kind of what money's made at the other end. And those values change depending on where you build across the district. So if you're looking in an affluent rural area where it costs more potentially to buy the land, but your build costs are very similar across the district, but then you would yield a higher value when you sold, for example, say a residential property in a particular part of the district compared to another area. There's, I guess, there's more money to be made. So those sill values reflect just the costs and values of those particular properties. So it's looking at those across the district, and that's it's quite common across sill charging schedules across those authorities which have adopted sill charges to have what they call differential rates. So it's different rates across different areas, and that's reflecting those values. So it's taking advantage, but I mean that in the nicest possible way, of those additional values from those properties. So it costs more in a particular area to provide something, but then you get more at the end. So it's just looking at those particular values. Hopefully that makes sense. But it is common across authorities that they do it in that way.
Right. But you referred to a consultancy report.
Yes.
They obviously gave you recommendations.
Yes.
So what happened then? Did that just was that an operational matter that officers decided, yes, this is what we're going to do, or did it come before members? I mean, how was that process decided?
Okay, so the consultants produced the report and they made recommendations to which values we should take on board. Now, officers made recommendations that would have gone through cabinet, and members had the opportunity to look at those and agree with them, challenge them if they didn't think they were appropriate. And as it is with other planning policy documents, they go through that democratic process, and members have the opportunity to scrutinise them, and then there's ultimately the cabinet decision saying that they agree with what's being put forward, and that would have gone through that process in order for us to then consult on them, get feedback, and then it would have gone through that process, and then the examiner ultimately has the kind of final recommendation of what should be taken forward. But as I say, it went through cabinet and full council before it was adopted.
Okay, thank you, Nicola.
Okay.
Before moving on to Councillor Cortell, I should actually point out that, for example, we charge Sill around the district, and obviously we abut other authorities. So, for example, in Hastings, they don't charge Sill at all. So we have situations across the district where on one side of the road in Hastings, on the ridge, there's no Sill. On the other side, there is Sill. And in fact, some roads along the ridge, half is Rother and half is Hastings. So you'll have Sill on one side of the road and not on the other. So there are those issues to think about. And different councils charge very different Sill rates. The rates that we're charging are not set by anyone else apart from ourselves, based on the work that Nicola has described. And they can be quite low, or they can be quite high, depending on what the district council or the borough council has decided after that work that's been done. I'll move on to Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. In fact, Nicola has answered most of what I wanted to ask in answer to Councillor Timpey. I would just like to make an observation, as it seems to me that based on the £50 per square metre in urban Bexhill, we're going to have very low takings on Sill, both strategically for Bexhill and in terms of the local revenue.
Could I respond to that? I think, so firstly, one of the pieces of work, very important pieces of work that's being done or started, is to really do that calculation. I mean, some broad calculations have been done in that respect over time, but you have a situation, for example, in Bexhill, where you have more houses being built but at a lower rate. In other rural areas, you've got, I won't say less houses, but quite less than, say, around Bexhill, and at a higher rate. So one of the pieces of information that we really need to get a grip with, which is what's being worked on, is precisely what is going to be generated where and when. So some money has been received relative to how long the Sill process has been going. It's relatively a lower level. The current plan goes up to 2028, and from the commencement of Sill to that time, I think the District Council was looking at raising something in the order of 32 million, but that's really quite back-ended. And I think, Dr. Leonard, do you want to make a comment?
I don't think there's much more to add to what's been said, Chairman. I think it's all going in the right direction. No.
Okay, all right. Does that answer your question, Councillor Cortell?
Thank you. Yes, Chair, it does.
Councillor Cook.
Thank you very much. I've kind of got a three-stranded question to ask. Does the difference in rates for private homes or retired or sheltered complexes and the zero rate on affordable and presumably social housing too, does that affect how a developer applies for planning permission? My second statement is the application at Saxon Hill Estates in Battle originally included affordable housing, but these have now, they're seeking now to have this withdrawn. So would we still collect Sill if they decide to build regular houses? And also, if the neighbourhood plan is passed, will we gain the full 25% on planning applications that were made before the national neighbourhood plan was applied? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to answer them in reverse again. So, favourite of mine. So, in terms of Battle neighbourhood plan, assuming that plan is made, we can't apply Sill to schemes to pass to the parish until the plan is made. So at the moment, Battle will be receiving 15% of the Sill for any developments which commence. Once a neighbourhood plan has passed, anything which is granted planning permission and then commences after that made date, then they get the increased Sill liability.
Okay, thank you.
Could I just clarify, because I think there's a little clarification there which might help. It's payable on the commencement of the development, as opposed to when it was given planning permission, with the exception that if planning permission was given before the adoption of Sill, obviously it's not liable. Does that help a little bit more? So, for example, if there's planning permission given for whatever site is in Battle, but they haven't commenced, and your neighbourhood plan is made, and then they commence, you will receive the 25%.
Oh, thank you very much. That's very helpful.
I'm saying that, and I'm 99.99% correct, but correct me if I'm wrong on that, Nicola.
Yeah, you're making me wonder now. I'll double check and I'll confirm.
I'm pretty sure that's I'm 99.999% sure. Unless Dr. Leonard would like to clarify, he's pretty good on these things too.
Normally, I'm going to jump into Nicola's court on this one. It's made me think as well. I was trying to busy look it up, but I couldn't see it. So we'll come back to you. But I'm sure you're right, Councillor Vinyl.
Okay, no, well, it would be very good to clarify. I'm pretty sure it's I'm right on that one. But continue on. Now you have a couple more questions there, Nicola, to deal with.
Yes, so I don't know the specifics about the Saxon Hill application specifically. As I explained before, Sill is only liable on the non-affordable housing. And when I talk about affordable housing, I do mean the entire spectrum of affordable housing. So social rent, affordable rent, shared ownership. None of those forms of affordable housing as defined in the National Planning Policy Framework are Sill liable. So we would only receive Sill for the market housing. If a scheme comes in with affordable housing, they will assume Sill liability for the market housing, and the affordable housing will be exempt. If we get a subsequent planning application that comes in that seeks to, this applies across all planning applications. If there was an application that came in to seek to remove the affordable housing for a viability issue, and that was granted, we would charge Sill across the entire development, because it would then be 100% market housing.
Okay, thank you.
And the first question related to...
Yeah, I just asked if the difference in rates actually would attract developers to put their designs in a different way.
I don't think it does necessarily, because the there are policies that require developments to be built to specific standards. So we have a policy that requires that all developments adhere to space standards. So certain types, 1 bed, single story flats effectively have to be built to a certain minimum size. 3 bed, 2 story developments have to be built to a certain size. There's always generally a minimum requirement in terms of a space standard, and we have specific policies across the district where we ask for more family housing in Bexhill and 30% 1 and 2 beds in rural areas. So there's an expectation of the kind of mix within developments already. I don't believe that those requirements are set in policy, and I don't believe that necessarily influences how a developer brings a site forward, the expectation is the Sill is built into their finance calculations when they look about bringing a site forward. It's a known factor because our Sill charging schedule is publicly available. Landowners, developers, land agents know that Sill is a requirement. It's something that's non-negotiable. It isn't anything that a developer can seek to remove for a particular application. So they should factor it into their finance. And the expectation is that it comes off the value of the land. So I don't think it shouldn't influence the mix. But I don't know whether Tim has something he wants to add to that.
Thank you.
Tim, did you want to add something to that? Tim? No? Right. Well, I should actually, it's worth clarifying that exemptions for CIL are not automatic. You have to apply for an exemption. And if you don't apply for the exemption, you won't get it. So it's not something that your planning permission might have affordable housing in it, unless before you start the development, you apply, it would be assumed that you were going to pay the full amount. Is that correct, Nicola?
That is correct. And because I would say as a general rule of thumb, because it means that a developer then ends up paying less Sill, they are particularly diligent in making sure they apply for the exemption, as a rule of thumb.
Could you just clarify, Nicola, how we make sure somebody actually pays the Sill at the appropriate point in time or at all? So they don't suddenly do a development, finish it, and we don't know that they haven't paid. How do we monitor that?
Well, we have processes in place to make sure that we consider how sites are built out. So we monitor building control commencements, either through our own building control, local authority building control, or through approved inspectors. That there's something that we look at, and
that's put together. Sorry, Nicola. It's put together through the business support unit, who have a series of spreadsheets. As developments are approved, they go on there. It's set against the sort of charging schedules that are on there, and then that's, as Nicola said, it's picked up through building control as the developments take place. It's on that basis, so it's all monitored in that way, and we have the ability to, if they fail to pay on time, to actually charge interest on that. So there is a penalty that comes with it if they fail to comply with it.
Right, thank you. And we'll have one more question from Councillor Harmer, and then move on to your next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nicola, thank you so much for this session. It's amazing. I'm learning stacks. I've got 3 questions. You mentioned the situation in Hastings, one side of the road, one council, one another, and the other one didn't charge Sill. So my first question is, why would a councillor not charge Sill? Next question is, if I've understood it correctly, we don't charge Sill on retail because that produces valuable retail. And if that's the case, before I became a councillor a few years ago, M&S was built at Ravenside, and there was some talk about the council getting 100,000. Is that some sort of new bonus thing? And my last question is, Rosewood Park was before Sill, but since then, Earlsfield Court 72-bed nursing home was built. So did we get Sill for that? That's a little bit mystified for me, because that was only built less than a year ago, I think. Thanks.
Okay, so I can't talk for other councils to speculate why they haven't chosen to adopt a Sill. I guess that's a political decision. It's something that they choose not to do. So it is entirely correct that Hastings isn't charging a Sill. And I guess there's the mix. There is a mix across the country of councils relying on simply Section 106 payments in order to deliver infrastructure on, with specific schemes, or a number of councils choosing to bring forward Sill. I honestly can't speculate under the specific reasons of why. Turning to your retail point, we do charge Sill for retail floor space. There's 3 different values relating to convenience and comparison floor space. So convenience floor space is your day-to-day essential needs effectively, and your comparison floor space is your bigger, more expensive purchases generally, and we charge different values for that, and depending where they are in the district there are slightly different values. So out of centre retail development yields a higher Sill charge than those inside an existing retail centre such as Bexhill Town Centre, for example. Going to your specific question about Marks and Spencer's at Ravenside, I believe that was granted planning permission before Sill was introduced, so we didn't receive Sill on that, but there were some Section 106 payments associated with that application, and Tim might be able to pick up on that specifically.
Chairman, I can do that.
Yeah,
I think I've got Dr. Leonard wanted to interject, so he might answer that, or Tim. So take it away.
Tim, I'll let Tim do it, and if he hasn't covered the point I'm going to make, then I'll come back.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, sorry, just on the Marks and Spencer's point, I believe that was granted permission around 2011, 2012, so it was well before Sill was introduced. As part of that development, and because it effectively meant the loss of a leisure facility, we managed to gain approximately £1 million in 106 payments towards leisure facilities within the town, and also to help improve the town centre. There was a part payment on that as well. Yeah, so that's the situation with Marks and Spencer. Sorry, Tony.
So, and the Earlsfield Court one with the care home that was built after Rosewood?
I don't know the specifics of that, but if that was granted after 2016, then that would have been still liable.
So just to clarify, if there's a planning permission that was pre-Sill that isn't liable for Sill, but then there's a modification. I think Rosewood had some where larger houses were converted to smaller ones, or I think there's one coming forward up in North Bexhill where they want to do the same sort of thing. If the floor space increases as a result of that change, would Sill then be chargeable just on that increase, or on the whole development?
Just on the increase.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that help, Kathy?
Yes, it does. I'm still interested in the Earlsfield Court bit, so if you could find out that for me, Tim. I do think I think it was a separate thing. And going forward, I would like a bit more training on 106, please, Jonathan.
We have that on the training programme.
Excellent, thank you.
Today, so that's good. So Nicola, I think we could move on to the next section. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So I'm moving on to Sill money spending now. So I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of where we are with strategic Sill and the Sill applications which have been awarded funding last year, just so members are aware of those schemes specifically. So there were 4 schemes that were granted Sill money. So there's the London Road Improvement Project in Bexhill. That is a number of junction and public realm improvements at the junction of Beeching Road and London Road. And the total cost of that infrastructure project is £1.2 million. Sill money was allocated £300,000, which equates to 25% of the total cost of that specific infrastructure scheme. We've also allocated £193,000 towards the Sidley Recreation Ground, BMX track, new skate park, floodlighting, improved accessibility and toilets. That equated to 33% of the total cost of infrastructure, as shown on the table on the slide. We awarded £75,000 to Battle Health Pathway. That was a purpose-built all-weather path around the grounds of the recreation area in Battle. And then a further project in Ticehurst Village. So the Ticehurst Village Square project, restoration of the historic village square, £125,000 was allocated towards that specific piece of infrastructure, part of a larger project just costing upwards of £500,000. So that process of allocating strategic Sill, so the money which is retained by Rother District Council for the delivery of strategic infrastructure, we awarded £693,000 from the pot last year, and that was as a result of inviting bids towards that process, and those were the schemes that were successful in being awarded Sill funding. As I said earlier, money was passed to the parishes where schemes had commenced and Sill had been received for those schemes, and those parish councils are required to report what they've received and what they've spent it on, and they either publish those reports on their own council website or in the absence of theirs, pass it to us and we'll publish it on their behalf. Some councils have also provided them to us, so where we have them, we've published them on our own website. Now, we've discussed quite a bit as part of this session the money that is retained by Rother District Council for the local Sill for Bexhill, because there is no parish town council within the Bexhill area. So we also opened the bidding for that process last year, but no money was awarded to projects in Bexhill as the first tranche of bids in 2019. A small section there, so I don't know if anyone has any questions in relation to the Sill spending.
Councillor Temby.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Okay, the applications, who considered them and who decided who would get what?
Okay, so I may pass over to Dr. Leonard as part of this, but there was an approved process that went through Cabinet, and it was a steering group, an officer steering group that was set up. We invited bids as part of that process, and we got a number of bids that was received to us. They were all assessed, reports put forward, and recommendations to a panel, and they decided the awards for those particular schemes.
Who was the panel? Who was the panel?
I'll interject.
Tony, if you could, yes.
As with all of this, these are all policy matters, so they didn't just go to Cabinet, they went up to full council. At the time of setting up the panel, the members' views, this may not be your views, but the members' view at that time was they didn't wish to be on the panel because they felt that it could often be involved with schemes which they would like to get behind, support and promote. So there was an officer panel, but what the members did set was very strict criteria which we had to work to in terms of scoring the projects that came forward and the amounts that we could allocate to projects and that. So for the strategic Sill, that's met, and that was determined by that officer panel, and then that has to be reported back through to Cabinet. In terms of the local Sill and the Bexhill Sill, that was slightly amended to include the portfolio holder, I believe, for Bexhill Affairs to sit in on that meeting. No, it wasn't. It was to do with the portfolio holder for strategic planning sat on that, which was Councillor Vinehall. So he sat in on those along with the officer team. Now, if any application came forward that involved the council submission, those officers and that particular service area would not participate in that panel discussions, and they would have to leave the room, and then that would be determined by the others. As Nicholas said, all the applications that came forward for the Bexhill local Sill did not meet the criteria and therefore were declined, where 4 out of the how many we received for the strategic Sill was approved and has gone forward. Now, they have to be spent within a certain time frame. There are legal agreements that sit between those organisations that have been awarded Sill, and they will be monitored by the Sill officer to make sure they're compliant with the conditions set out. I hope that answers the question.
Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yeah, I just wondered, does the criteria need amending if nobody in Bexhill qualified?
Well, the purpose of this Sill steering group is to do just that, to look at all the criteria that's been set previously, so that this administration can feel that they've got ownership to it. And so as we go through the terms of reference, I suspect some of those criteria will change and amend.
Thank you very much.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Well, thank you, Nicola. We don't have any more questions on this section, so could you progress?
Okay, so we're on the final part of my presentation now. So I'm just going to highlight the next steps for the steering group. So been using the terms of reference to set out what the next steps for the group are, so everyone's aware of the scope of the group. So the main aim of the steering group is to consider and make recommendations to Cabinet on how the council's retained, so the strategic portion that I've been talking about of the community infrastructure levy should be prioritised. And there's quite a ranging scope as part of that. So we'll be looking at infrastructure delivery, the governance of Sill, the thresholds for spending Sill and how they interrelate with the council's community grant funding process. Looking at strategic Sill and whether there's a need or desire to do redistribution of that. And then looking at the Sill charging framework in itself and whether there'll be a recommendation relating to a review. So a specific approach was set out, setting out 6 key things that the group would be looking at. So reviewing the methodology for allocating strategic Sill and determining funding applications. That was covered briefly a moment ago. Councillor Vinehall's already discussed this earlier, but we'll be looking at setting out a detailed estimate of future Sill to be collected, much more detailed consideration of what that future Sill funding will be. We'll be looking at good practice and other evidence from other local planning authorities. Rother was one of the first local authorities, one of the early adopters of Sill, and then one of the early kind of forerunners of how to the allocation of the Sill process, inviting bids and such. So we'll be looking at what other local planning authorities have been doing in that regard. Consulting broadly with infrastructure providers, town and parishes and other interested parties on what any proposed approaches to the allocation and use of Sill will be. Considering how strategic Sill should be prioritised through any revised infrastructure delivery plan and our forthcoming infrastructure funding statement. I mentioned that really early on in the presentation, talked about the regulation 123 list and how that will be replaced at the end of the year by our infrastructure funding statement, looking at what money has been collected and what infrastructure we seek to spend Sill on going forward and what that might cost and how it will be funded, whether wholly or partly through Sill, Section 106, other types of funding. So looking at that and that process. And then reviewing the strategic Sill governance arrangements, proposing a approach for allocating and spending strategic Sill payments across the district. And then just in terms of reporting, the terms of reference set out that a report will go back to overview and scrutiny committee in November 2020, and then a further report to Cabinet in December 2020. So yeah, I've finished my presentation now. I don't know if anyone has any further questions.
We have a question from Councillor Byrne.
Thank you. This is more, again, this is on terms of reference. We've already spoken about the differing rates of Sill, and Councillor Harmer asked the question, why would anyone elect not to charge Sill? I wondered if the committee would look at ways in which the Sill could be, the Sill rates charged could be varied for various developments as to incentivise development in maybe a particular area that we were keen on having development, but so far hadn't attracted any developers. So would that be within the remit, and would there be a mechanism for varying these rates of Sill?
Did you want to respond to that, Nicola?
I'm happy to briefly cover that, but I suspect Dr. Leonard will want to add some points. I think it's within the scope to make recommendations about reviewing a Sill charging schedule. But as I explained earlier on in the process, it's quite a lengthy and detailed process under which to go by. If there was a desire to amend a charging schedule, we'd have to think very carefully of the timing of that and how that sits with the local plan update, because we'd need to look at new infrastructure to support any new development. And whilst it would be for an independent inspector to make recommendations and ultimately through a report say what charging rates would be. So it may be within the scope of the group to recommend a review, but it would be for an independent inspector to ultimately verify what those rate changes might be.
So the answer, Terry, is yes. There is real opportunity to look at those things, but I think getting into Sill is one thing. Changing it is there is levels of time and complexity involved. It's not something you can just pass a motion to say let's reduce our Sill charging by 10% or something, or increase one area and decrease another. There is a process which is applied to us, not by us.
I think that answers my question. Really was looking at whether we could use those rates to incentivise areas that have been unpopular with developers. And I think the answer is no, and probably quite properly so. I'm sure there's other ways we could incentivise development in the less popular areas.
Well, it's the question you ask is a valid question, and it's a question within the terms of reference, because having now had some experience over the last few years about how development is progressing in Rother, and therefore what impact is Sill having on that development? Is it suppressing it or not? Is it suppressing it in certain areas? We talked about the Hastings Fringe. That might be a case. So there are questions to be asked, and the answers may not always be as straightforward as we think. Dr. Leonard, do you have a comment that you want to make on that?
No, I think it's a healthy debate, and I think it's one that if we're looking to do changes to the charging schedule, then as Nicola said, we would need to go out to an independent person to do that, and that would be a fairly lengthy process, and it might be better and more effective to find other mechanisms to try and to encourage developers to develop. If however through this process members feel that the charging arrangements are so wayward that they need to be reviewed, and that's something will have to be taken back to Cabinet and to full council to review it. But at the moment, I think it's a fair question to be asking. It's a matter of when we get to the end of this process to whether it's one we want to follow up.
Do we have any further questions for Nicola on this? This is the end of her presentation. There might be some more general questions which have arisen that you haven't asked. No? I've got nothing more in the chat box. Well, Nicola, that was a very good presentation. Thank you very much for that. I think it stimulated a lot of thought by those members who have attended today, and others may watch the presentation on the YouTube, and it's there for them to watch should they feel they need to update their knowledge. There's only two more items on the agenda for today. One is just to note that in the pack there is the background information links which deal with all the elements of CIL. It is quite complicated, there's a lot to it, but they are there. And things like the report that I think somebody asked about, I think it was Hazel Tempe, about how these were developed. There is a report by the consultant which goes into all the detail of exactly how they went about that process. And that leaves us just with the last item, which is the date of the next meeting. And hopefully by that meeting, some of that more detailed financial work will be done. And that meeting will be on the 7th of September this year at 2 p.m. And on that note, I will, unless anyone has any further questions or comments, no, I will close the meeting at 12:31. Thank you very much for those who attended. Thank you.